Well, thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and I'm happy today to be sponsoring this event on a kind of sad occasion, but also an opportunity to remember who and what we're grateful for, and to think about the legacies of Pope Francis. So obviously, if you look at our colleagues, I'm happy to be doing this with the Department of Religious Studies, and Professor Carolyn Johnson-Hodge, the chair, who helped me put this together. And let me just introduce them if you don't know who all of them are. Professor Mary Roche. I won't say professor in front of all their names. Audrey Seah, Jacques Linder, Eduardo Gonzalez, Chanelle Robinson, Bill Clark, and Matthew Schmalz. So they are going to be our discussants today, and we're trying to keep this more as a discussion than a panel sort of thing to talk about the legacy of Pope Francis. And rather than do a traditional Q&A, what I'm going to do is I've asked Sarah Potter, who's over there, just occasionally will bring the mic around and just ask the people in the audience to just say one or two things that you remember or think about Pope Francis' legacy that you'd want to highlight. I'll remind everyone it's being recorded for YouTube broadcast, as we do for all of our talks, but I suppose if you say anything, it'll be the back of your heads anyway, since the mics are in the back of your room. Pope Francis is such a multifaceted leader. There are so many ways we can look at what he left behind, ways that he tried to influence us, ways maybe he tried and didn't succeed, and maybe ways that he tried to succeed. If I ask the panelists, and we can see who wants to start, but just one area of the greatest impact that you see for Pope Francis, that is a legacy that's really changed things, so where his efforts worked. What would you name? Who wants to? Bill?
Thinking about that, the thing that has occurred to me as something that might not get mentioned per se is his style that I would characterize as pastoral listening. And I think that's behind a lot of the things that people are more likely to name, and particularly synodality. But from my point of view, the desire to really see people and hear what they had to say about their experience with the church and in life in general led to a lot of the kind of signature moves of his papacy, culminating in synodality, but also I think responsible for a number of ways in which he learned along the way, and could perhaps by some people be accused of inconsistency, but I would prefer to think of all of that as listening and learning, and I think that to me that is one of the most important legacies.
So you dropped the word synodality. That seems like one of those inside churchy word things that the rest of us maybe don't need to care about. Can you just say briefly, like, why should we care?
Okay. This is a way of understanding how the church is organized and could govern itself. Synods are gatherings traditionally of bishops, but Pope Francis has seen them as an opportunity to hear people from across the spectrum of members of the church, and there have been several of them during his papacy, but the most important one in terms of the concept of synodality just ended in October. It actually went on for 4 years, and that was a very unusual way to approach these gatherings, and people who are not bishops, not clerics at all, had the opportunity to speak and to vote in the most recent pair of synod gatherings. And so that is kind of an institutionalized version of the pastoral listening that I was talking about before.
So anyone can jump in, but his speech when he talked at the beginning about what he was going to do said maybe the church was too caught up in itself and its internal things and had to get out into the world and had to be there. Is synodality contrary to that, or does it fit that pattern? Anybody, but does it help us get out in the world, or was it just sort of, is it an inside story? Chanelle, do you want to go?
I think and my comment will kind of dovetail into this question, that synodality really emerges out of a desire for the church to engage in intentional listening. And I think that Francis was a pope who listened, and that includes listening to the ecological crisis. The impact of Laudato Si is what strikes me the most, that he was a pope that really cared for the environment, that he addressed the document not only to Roman Catholics, but to all people of goodwill, that this was a document for the entire world, and that he recentered that all of creation is interconnected, which I think was something that the church needed to be reminded of, especially as it thinks through Catholic social teaching, but also that impacted a lot of different spheres beyond theology.
I would just add with regard to your question about synodality as more of an institutional thing, the way that you've just answered that and focused us on Laudato Si shows that the impetus behind synodality is something that moved in all directions. And although that idea of a synod is an in-church institutional move to open up the participation as broadly as he did, means that the church is going to hear about a lot of things that it could have otherwise ignored.
Matthew, I'm going to turn to you because I know Professor Schmalz will have to leave by about 1:45, so I promised I'd certainly call on him early. Major impact, biggest impact?
Well, I'd like to echo what Bill and Chanelle have said and maybe add a little more about Pope Francis's style. I was particularly struck, though not in a very positive way, I have to say, by a recent interview that Timothy Cardinal Dolan gave on the Today Show about Pope Francis, and describing Pope Francis as a simple man, and we need, simplicity and so forth. And then he went on to talk about various things that Francis didn't do well, and emphasize how the new pope needed to bring more doctrinal clarity and so forth. And so I want to, when we're talking about listening and a pope who listens, we're also talking about a pope who has tremendous spiritual depth. And reaching that level where you can go into the world and deeply feel and understand what other people are talking about, and meet them at where they are in their personal lives, is really something crucial. So right now, if you follow Catholic Twitter or the media, there's a lot of debate about where the next papacy needs to move doctrinally, how it needs to move forward or push back on synodality and so forth. But I think certainly within the near future, a fundamental change in style has been made, and it will be very, very difficult for the next pope to move away from that interpersonal, interactive style. And so I think when we're talking about style, it's really important to emphasize that style has substance, and that Pope Francis was a pope who really deeply reflected on and discerned where he thought the church needed to go.
I like the notion of style having substance because one might discount that in terms of long-term change, but I think both you and Bill seem to be signaling particularly that the style is part of that. Who else wants? Audrey?
Yeah, I want to just piggyback off of what has been said, and I'm thinking here of the global church, particularly in spaces where Christianity is not the majority religious tradition. A few years ago, maybe in 2022, the Asian Bishops' Conference met, and Cardinal Francis Xavier of Thailand, so Bangkok, said, what would be most credible for the church in Asia are the lay witness, so the actual lives of how Catholics, in those spaces, not what the priests preach. And I think that for people in the majority world where Christianity has not been a 1,000-year tradition, right? Pope Francis, by the way he led his life, has really been a credible witness. So he went out to the margins. After, in his, I think, 2013 first Chrism Mass, asked priests to smell like the sheep, right? He famously said that. And I think he actually did it too, and that's what's so powerful about that. He's the first pope in the modern period that has been to an active war zone, Central African Republic. That's mind-blowing. I think that's a real credible witness right there. He went to Mongolia. The Catholic population there is only 1,400 people. They're countries that people would not think about. These are not sites of power who want to think about the church and its history. But it's really something that inspires people. Holy Thursday, I think, is a theology that he comes back to again and again liturgically. He changed the foot washing rite, the rubric, to include all peoples. And he has washed the feet of Muslims, women on Holy Thursday as part of this rite, which is optional in the liturgy, but he does it in order to really make the point, right, that the Son of Man came to serve and not be served. And who does Christ serve? Everyone. And I think that's a really powerful part of his legacy as a witness that we don't hear about as often. And I think it's important and hopefully will be unpacked for years to come.
So maybe one tension we'll see, we've got witness, style, way of being, and then there's also the church, maybe expectation around documents, teachings, things like that, and probably some tensions there. Mary, in some of your work, you may be seeing some of that, a profound witness.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that, similarly, that certainly the pastoral style, the kind of prophetic witness, the sort of, I will do these things, sort of really embodying, right, a way of living in the gospel, a way of listening with the ear of the heart, and not necessarily, I don't want to, make too much of a sort of binary, right, but not sort of listening for academic arguments, intellectual arguments, right, things like that, but really listening with the ear of the heart. And I think that as Matthew was saying, it would be very hard, I think, for anybody to step into that position without those skills and without that kind of, what I'm concerned about is that someone will have mastered the style, but not the substance. So thinking about those things and that kind of prophetic witness, and I always come back to one of our colleagues and very good friend of the McFarland Center, Jim Corkery, when he would be he had this way of talking about, people who were detectives of sin and people who were detectives of grace. And I think Pope Francis was a detective of grace. And I think that's sort of where the opposition arises, because other people are more interested in doctrinal clarity for the purpose of detecting sin and sort of meeting it out, rather than what I really appreciated sometimes, right, was some doctrinal ambiguity, because we here we talk about patience with ambiguity, but there's also possibility in ambiguity that I think is really valuable. So it's not simply that we tolerate ambiguity when we could get rid of it, right? We could sort of have the ambiguity as sort of a constitutive kind of element, right, of all of this. So I think that the goodwill that generated among people, and I focus here on people who have been hurt by the church, the clergy, sex abuse crisis, LGBTQIA folks, indigenous folks, women, right? That a tremendous amount of goodwill garnered there, and trust, even though, right, there was a hope for some doctrinal change that didn't really happen. And so I think that Pope Francis, I very much appreciate sort of the pastoral style and the listening with the ear of the heart. And I'm not optimistic or sanguine about what comes next. To hold on to that kind of pastoral sense, in the sense that we need to really meet each other where we are and listen with the ear of the heart. I'd like that, for that to be matched by support for people who are also trying to make legislative change on behalf of those people, human rights, and things like that. So that's, I suppose, not so much, I wouldn't call it kind of a disappointment, but hoping that we can kind of keep that moving along for justice.
So I like that you have hope, which is the more theological version, which is different from optimism, as you've pointed out. Let me just ask if there are a couple of people in the audience. We'll come back to these themes. Anyone want to interject something? Sarah? Something you want to say about Pope Francis that you just want to?
Well, we know that Pope Francis was very well traveled, but the first place he went to was Lampedusa to underscore the plight of migrants. And with the climate crisis, with wars, I mean, there's going to be more and more migrants, and he just challenged us to welcome the stranger. I mean, that is so biblical. That stands out to me.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. I think that that's like all of the issues on migration, on the environment. I think that one of the challenges, or sort of the growing edge, I think, where that is still sort of present, right, is the way in which those issues, which he really centered in an important way and tried to center them for the American Catholic Church in a way that was very, very difficult to do. And at the same time, also recognizing the way that those issues intersect with gender inequality, racial inequality, the status of indigenous people, how all of those things are really so deeply connected. And thinking about the way in which the sort of talking about gender ideology, right, and sort of condemning that, which I don't think he was as interested in doing as other people were interested in doing on his behalf. But thinking about the way in which those issues are really connected, and for the U.S. Church, thinking about how important and vital those issues were to Francis, and how, again, there's sort of, the U.S. Church and the way we voted and things like that, right, that we can sort of say that we're committed to migrants, we're committed to the environment, and yet sit very comfortably with the majority of Catholics voting for policy, for a person who would undermine all of that work in favor of other policies. And so I'm concerned that the gender ideology is the thing that is going to take center stage. So the doctrinal clarity that people want is really on a very, in my experience, a very narrow set of questions. So.
Thank you. So I think that the aspect of Francis's mic check. Okay. The aspect of his style of leadership that stands out to me is very consistent with everything that I've heard so far, and I think it's captured really well in a title that I've heard used to describe him a few times, which is the Pope of the Peripheries. And I think that it reflects an aspect of his style of leadership that was recognizable from the very outset. And it involved actively working to recover forms of relationality which have either been devalued, damaged, broken, or turned into unhealthy and harmful forms of relationality. And this is something that required Francis to name and to contest various ideologies which he would identify as the idols of the present, which amount to ruptures of our interconnectedness with one another, with the rest of creation, and with the source of that creation, in a way that generates suffering and prevents humans from becoming what they should be. When I say that it was there from the outset, I mean that quite literally, because moments after he was elected Pope, he was seated next to the Archbishop Emeritus of Sao Paulo, who turned to him and hugged him and kissed him and asked him to remember the poor. Don't forget the poor, he told him. And Francis recounts that experience, and he says that he would think about that immediately after he heard it from his fellow cardinal. The poor, and as he thought about that, the name Francis came to him. And that's the connection that he made between the style of leadership that he would seek to embody and those peripheries that were manifested in a variety of ways, from the ecological dimension to migrant experiences, to those excluded in a variety of different ways, indigenous peoples beyond the Catholic Church, not just within the Catholic Church, addressing humans as such. And I think that that's something that is going to play a big role in how the next pope is assessed, whether or not the heart of Francis is reflected in the vision that they bring to what it means to be Bishop of Rome.
Or yeah, if I could just quickly, I think, just add something that Pope Francis sort of mentions in his papal encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which was a long reflection of him from him on the parable of the Good Samaritan, where he mentions that each one of us might find a different place in that story. We might be the person who walks by in the global north. That's most of the time. He seems to suggest that we are the one that's just passing by. Sometimes in some situations we might be the Good Samaritan, or the Samaritan, or the Good Samaritan, and other times we might be the person on the side of the road. But before he sort of gets into that, Francis, writing in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, encourages us to dream in the first chapter, saying that we need dreamers in this moment. So in thinking, as I've been reflecting after his passing, I think I've been thinking about what is Francis's dreams. Is he one to sort of outline what a dream could look like for the world or for the church? And we could look at his practices, which a lot of us have already mentioned, such as washing people's feet who are closely not close to the church, meeting with others, calling for ceasefire in Gaza, as well as in Myanmar on Easter, as well as nuclear disarmament, which is a big topic of my own sort of interest, is that Francis is sort of seen as this great disarmer. He calls disarmament a moral obligation for Christians worldwide to shed sort of the fear and the securities that we hold on to that gives us meaning in this world might actually be, as Eddie said, sort of false idols that we hold on to that continue to build up walls where we need to start tearing them down.
So as you're talking, I'm thinking back to among the popes I've lived through, and there are more and more of them as I go on, right? But, in my very earliest childhood, John the 23rd, who I have no memories of, but I think of his style. So as you've talked about the style, there was sort of good Pope John and these memories that sort of endure, and that's a really important element. And there are also, if I think of the train of Catholic social thought, I can look at a lot of what happened there, and those are documents, things that get quoted. He also started us on the way of Vatican II, and synodality could be a piece of that. So in my mind, I often compare Francis most to John the 23rd. Do you think that the document legacy of Francis, certainly you mentioned Laudato Si, do you think the document legacy will be as important, or if you put those three elements together, where down the line, 60 years from now, whatever it is, people will remember Francis? What of those things will stand out?
Just one really quick thing, and I'll turn it over to Bill's got the mic, but I think this is another sort of shift for me in the documents and reading the documents, and I don't spend a whole lot of time reading Vatican documents. That's like not my way of passing the time. But in some of the documents, right, even the sort of reference to other writers who are not previous pope, everything is quoting a previous pope, as we have always said, in happy memory and things like that.
Prior Catholic
Right,
social
prior,
thought,
right,
all the
just
footnotes
repeats-
would be the popes before.
Right,
And
which
suddenly
is,
in these documents, you saw references
Yeah.
outside of that.
which I think is helpful. Again, it's that listening, but it's also a bit more transparent about where the ideas that work their way into a document come from, and frankly, giving some people credit for those important ideas who are otherwise hidden. But the sort of the substance of it all, I'll turn it over to somebody else. But I know I
Catholic
appreciate
social
that.
teaching would not pass our plagiarism test. It might be ghostwritten by someone else and drawing on someone else. So it was a different set of criteria, but anyway.
No, just with regard to the documents and the official teaching in general, there's been a lot of unfriendly comments about what Francis has published, and in particular, it was noted early on that his theological style was more like pastoral theology, and I've gotten used to hearing sort of slightly behind the hand sniggers about pastoral theology. That means it's not theology at all. I couldn't possibly disagree more with that.
You help people out, pastoral theology versus.
In the idea of a more academic theology, you are reading and comparing sources and going back to patristic sources at the beginning of the church's theological culture and so forth. Pastoral theology is looking in some ways to apply that other kind, that more academic kind of teaching, but there's a particular kind of theology that actually grew up in Argentina called the theology of the people, that is a kind of pastoral theology that is particularly interested in emphasizing the people of God, ordinary Catholics, doing what they do to express their Catholicism, that they are not just worthy subjects of theology, but they are agents of theology. So that this kind of theology wants to reach out to the people and the products of the listening that we've been talking about as sources of theology, not just people like Saint Augustine or Origen or Tertullian, all the patristic sources of long ago. But what are people who are living Catholicism today in the world actually teaching us about Catholicism? And I think that the documents that Francis has put forward in his papacy are much more of that sort. And in order to understand, in order to give them credit, in order to respect them, you have to begin with that whole notion of pastoral listening that leads to an understanding that the Spirit of God is working in the voices of the people that you're listening to.
Anyone in the audience want to remember one thing? Bill? We'll wait for the mic to come to you.
There are a couple of scenes that stick in my memory. One of those scenes is his celebrating the wedding at 38,000 feet. Remember that? On a flight from Chile to someplace. But the two of the airline personnel were getting married, and he married them way up in the air. But I've got a memory of that. That's kind of good. Another one is at a penance service at St. Peter's Square, and there were all these places set up for confessions, and he was hearing. And he walked across, not just to hear the confession, but he went to confession himself. And that sticks in my mind as well. So you get these scenes. The last one is during the when the virus was all over the place, and there was nobody in St. Peter's Square. There's a scene of him walking across an absolutely deserted St. Peter's Square, and it's a very touching scene. Anyways, so a lot of my memories are tied up with pictures like that. Yeah.
That moment you mentioned during the COVID-19 and the empty square,
Right.
I remember friends of mine who are of no religious persuasion at all kind of texting me and saying, you've got to see this, you've got to watch this, that it had a really profound effect on many different people.
I'll just make another comment in connection with the question about the predecessors and the continuity of the documents of Catholic social teaching. And something that Spanish theologian Juan José Tamayo mentions when he discusses Pope Francis's legacy that I find very relevant to that question and quite interesting is that, well, 2 points. One, with regard to his 2013 apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, he says that Pope Francis goes further than his predecessors in critiquing neoliberal capitalism, insofar as he's identifying the injustice of such orders, not at the level of their consequences or of their impact, but rather at the very roots of the system. And that's something that's much more radical in the etymological sense of the term than Pope John Paul II or Benedict XVI, John the 23rd. And so he's consistent with the critiques that they offer, but he pushes it further. And then another area of the documents that he's produced that pushes him a little further as well, according to Tamayo, is the Querida Amazonia Apostolic Exhortation, which came out of the Amazon Synod of 2019, which also offers dreams, 4 of them in particular, and dreams that are transformative not only of the social order, but also of our relationship with the natural world and our understanding of non-Western cultures in a way that is reflected at the very beginning of the Synod when Pope Francis addresses the participants and cautions them when considering the cultures of the indigenous peoples of the Amazon not to impose a Eurocentric Western cultural assumption in terms of the solutions they might want to provide, but rather first to listen in a way that's consistent with synodality. And to learn and to be transformed by the cultural resources that are present in the Amazon, and then to think about solutions. And in fact, he even encourages us to think about the poetry that they've produced, right? Listen to the art that they've created, and learn from those sources because they are interconnected with the Amazon and with the natural world that becomes a part of the fabric of the identity of those cultures. And in that regard, Tamayo says Pope Francis is the first decolonial pope. Requiring a transformation of Eurocentric thinking that takes him to a place that his predecessors didn't go either. And in that regard, Tamayo goes a little further than Stan Chuilo, who says that Pope Francis is the first post-colonial pope. And he says it's actually a little more radical than that. There's a sensitivity to the assumptions and biases that are made by bishops coming from the West that have to be critically reinterrogated and become explicit to those who are engaging indigenous peoples. In a way that I think really attests to something unique that Pope Francis has produced in the documents that then will be inherited by future popes.
I'd like to add to your attention, Eddie, to indigenous peoples and Pope Francis's papacy, not only in South America, but in Canada as well. We saw in 2021 when there was this exposure of these unmarked mass graves on a former Roman Catholic residential school in British Columbia, this urgency for the Roman Catholic Church to respond. That within the Canadian context, over 60% of these residential schools, these sites of attempted cultural genocide, were run by Roman Catholic orders and churches of various degrees. And so by Pope Francis coming to Canada, making that transatlantic trip, listening to indigenous peoples, bringing those pairs of moccasins back from the Vatican to say, I am committing to walking with you. There was this attention to not just going to the margins, but recognizing that the constitution of the very body of Christ includes all kinds of people with all kinds of histories. And I think it takes a lot of courage to grapple with the church's colonial past. It takes a lot of courage to name these atrocities and abuses as contrary to the gospel, which is what he says in this penitential pilgrimage. And so I remain profoundly and deeply moved by Pope Francis's pastoral attention here, but also by the documentary history that emerges because of this. That we see the dicasteries of both culture and education coming together to repudiate any ecclesial support of the doctrine of discovery, for example. That this comes about because of this deep attention to indigenous communities. That's a clear mark of his papacy.
So I want to go back to the question that Tom had asked about his legacy. And I think for me, to think about Pope Francis' legacy, we have to ask for whom? And I think all that has been mentioned has been really important, especially for theologians. But I'm going to say devil's advocate here. And I think a big part of his legacy will be kind of the Wi-Fi Pope. I remember the first time he took a Wi-Fi with a group of young people and it went viral online.
Selfie.
A selfie,
Selfie,
yeah,
yeah.
but with other people, so it becomes a Wi-Fi. Yeah, a selfie is like if you do it solo. He doesn't do selfies, which is a good thing because that would be kind of weird. And I thought, oh, this guy's fun. And then he kept doing it. And what that told me eventually was this is not a public relations stunt because he's the new pope. I think seeing that in line with everything else that he's done, he's really using social media, and he started the dicastery for communication, Vatican Communications, Vatican YouTube channels. It's a way to listen and to make contact with people on the peripheries, people who may not be ready to enter a church and converse with him. Right? They get to see the church with the people. But I also want to mention how this sort of outreach is so important to deaf Catholics. So in 2016, he made a video that went viral in the deaf Catholic world. It was a 2016 Christmas message. And you can tell he's kind of awkward. He's standing there. He's copying someone else signing to him, the signs. And it's just, Merry Christmas, pray for me. And he's smiling and sort of being a little awkward. But it's so delightful. And it's an Italian sign language. And it went viral. And so it has resurfaced recently because of his passing. But I think about that in 2016, 2018, I had the privilege of meeting him at a Wednesday audience when I was on an international pilgrimage with deaf Catholics. And I shook his hand, and he struck me as one of those people that he'll look at you in the eye when he shakes your hand. Like, it's really about connecting with the person. Right? And the person who, one of the priests who had spent years organizing that trip said to me, it's great that deaf Catholics are meeting the Pope, but it's more important for the Pope to meet deaf Catholics. Fast forward to 2020 or 2021, the Vatican Dicastery for Communication started a campaign or this program called No One Left Behind. They started YouTube channels in signed languages so that the Wednesday audiences would be interpreted and the major masses. His funeral had 4 signed languages: French, Italian, Spanish, and English. ASL, American Sign Language. That is amazing. So if we think about reaching the margins, listening, communication, I think this kind of, way of doing it, I think he leaves a legacy that people have to follow because he set those systems up, which is also really important.
I love your starting point about depends on which community looks at him, because I think in a lot of places in the world they will look at the questions that are important. I just noticed 2 of you mentioned the word dicastery, which is another word that maybe is a sort of inside Catholic-y world, but maybe to call attention a little bit, dicastery is one of the, what we used to call congregations in Rome, the sort of the curia who run things. And probably part of the reason he got elected was because the curia left over from John Paul II and under Benedict was really running things amok and telling the rest of the world what to do. And a lot of the bishops who elected him said, that's enough, we want to put a stop to this. So by creating dicasteries, he changed if the Holy Office, really, the successor to the Inquisition, was in charge with theological questions, was considered the top one. That was demoted, and evangelization was put to the top. The way that the offices were reconsidered, their role in the world, I think is something he changed that seems very much like inside churchy stuff, but on the other hand, is pushing a radical reconception of who the church is and what its relationship is to the rest of the world. Who else has something you want to add? Anything? Something you appreciate or a moment? Brent in the front has one, but if any students do, I'd be happy to hear those.
Thank you. I think the thing that has struck me most about Francis's papacy has to do with synodality as, in a way, obviously synodality comes out of the Second Vatican Council, but also comes out at this particular historical moment, and the way that Francis put it forward comes out of his own spirit and spirituality. And I think it's one of the most challenging aspects, because frequently people look at the Pope and talk about the Pope in terms of liberal and conservative issues, and then on something of a political-like spectrum. And I think the challenge inside of synodality is fundamentally listening, and challenging us all to truly listen to the Holy Spirit as mediated through all the voices of people in every corner of the church and every culture. And that's a very hard thing to do, but I think it draws us to that spiritual grounding as a church, that the only place where the empathy of Christ, which I think is a defining feature of Jesus Christ, can expand and expand in all of us, and therefore collectively in the church, to really meet where the body of Christ is wounded and seeks healing. And I think that will be an enduring legacy as long as the synodality continues and doesn't kind of become a project just of this papacy that diminishes in significance.
So if I imagine back to 2013 and the political, cultural world that Francis started out in, and think of today, 2013 to 2025, he's certainly working in a much more authoritarian context. He's a pope who was so much about promoting peace and worked on that. If you could look at it and say none of his peace promotion efforts have worked. We're in a much more authoritarian cultural context than we were in before. And Francis looks like an isolated figure on the world stage, much more than he did before. So did he fail? Or did he succeed by keeping us sort of, Jacques, you think about peace and conflict?
There we go. Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what we mean by success and failure. I mean, we are all humans, so I fail every day. I'm sure you all do too, in different ways. So in some sense, we can think about, how are we judging successes and failures? I think there is still war, there is still violence, but I think Francis, and as we've sort of touched on, provides sort of a lens or a method in terms of thinking about how Catholics and people of goodwill can approach global conflicts, can approach conflicts in your local communities as well. So speaking of dicasteries, along with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, the Vatican worked in, I forget what year it was, maybe 2022, to sort of promote a large document on nonviolence, which can be a resource for people to think about how to address violence in their own communities. The Pope isn't saying that violence is going to stop. Francis wasn't naive in that way, but I think what he does is promote sort of a morality of discernment, not only for the Catholic Church itself, but also for the individual. So when the Pope says nuclear weapons are illegal to possess across the world, does that mean that all of the soldiers need to abandon their positions if you're Catholic? Depending on the ethicists you talk to, they will tell you different things. I'll tell you something different, which you can ask me after the panel or the discussion. But essentially, what again, in sort of that ambiguity that we were talking about earlier, there's an opportunity to think what does success look like for oneself? What does failure also look like, and be able to judge on sort of that scale? So I can't give you an objective answer there, Tom. I'm sorry. I'm sure Twitter might have something for you too.
We'll have a short, quick
a
answer.
poll. Yeah.
My first reaction to the question was just way too soon to be answering questions like that. And I think the only way that he could fail utterly is if we fail utterly to pick up the challenges that we've been talking about and the things that we've noticed about his style and how important it was, and particularly the listening, the broadening, the reaching out to the margins. If that disappears in the church, then we've all failed. And I think that's going to be the most important measure. And he never struck me as someone who, well, actually, he said it directly. I saw a piece of an interview the other day when he was asked, what do you think your legacy will be? And he said, I've never asked that question. It's the church. He said, whatever the church is our legacy. I think that was his answer. And I think that's quite literally, practically the case.
Apparently, we were at an event yesterday where someone said that William Barber posted something on Instagram that said, what was it? Today we mourn Pope Francis, tomorrow be Pope Francis, which is along the same lines. So maybe to close up, if we had one thing about what it will take to be Pope Francis that you want to take away and share. I can ask one person from the audience to make a memory and give everyone to think about what's the thing, what would it be like, the thing you would want to do to be like Pope Francis, to carry forth his work? Jacques, go ahead.
Yeah, or I could sort of jump in quickly, and I think just to say, I think to live simply, right? I think we were, you see pictures of where he slept, how many positions he owned. He committed to poverty as a member of the Jesuits. And I think in his writings, he continues to think about sort of, he encourages us to think about possession and ownership. So that countries' resources aren't only for them, they're for the entire world. And I think that can also be scaled down to an individual level, right? What is really mine in this whole cosmic order that is God's creation? And I think Pope Francis would say, not a lot. So what does it mean to think about that and to live simply?
I had an experience over Easter of being asked to lead the Triduum in a very traditionalist church in rural Virginia, and that's not my usual scene. And I had the experience there of discovering what it's like to really try to listen to people who I have had a tendency to dismiss. And I think that the big thing for me is going to be to take this example seriously and not just listen to the people that I like listening to, but listening to people who are genuinely in a different place than I am. And I know from that one experience last week, I know that I have lots to learn by doing that.
I would say quite simply, in his words, hacer un lío, make a mess, stir things up, embody the disruptive solidarity that he constantly proclaimed, and that he said was so sorely needed in the world, not just between humans, but between who we are and the rest of creation, and that requires stirring things up, and he surely did. So I think that continuing in those footsteps would be one of the best ways to really keep his memory embodied in the world.
I would say to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, right? A phrase that comes up so often in Laudato Si, that as human beings we have a responsibility to care for all those beings, even beyond our species. When I was in Dubai for the Conference of Parties, the 28th gathering of COP, a couple years ago, I was very glad to witness the inauguration of the Faith Pavilion, that the role of religion, the role of spirituality was also kind of coming into the fore in this secular space to think about our ecological future. And that Pope for Pope Francis, it's not just something that only belongs to future generations, but is a responsibility that belongs to all of us to kind of build on your language of solidarity, Eddie. He describes an intergenerational solidarity that we're all going to need each other in order to move forward and to create a livable world. And so I would say to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor together.
I agree with all that has been mentioned, but I hope to add something to this conversation. I think one of the things that has moved me the most about Pope Francis' papacy is his emphasis on mercy as a constitutive character of God. He appointed missionaries of mercy from all around the world, and these are priests that were specially selected to be part of a group to administer the sacraments of mercy. And I think for myself, I would love to be able to live out what it means to be mercy.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I have to confess, Tom, that I have not been thinking about how to be like Pope Francis. So I don't really think about it that way. So that was a surprise question. And thinking, I guess, in some way thinking about to be keeping my eye on Francis, which again, sort of is the task of the day, and we're sort of really paying attention to what he was doing. But that's not who he wanted anybody to be looking at, right? And I think certainly to keep an eye on Christ for Christians is certainly, but also then to sort of this idea of mercy and the peripheries, which we talk about, and the margins. But it's really, I think when you gave the example of his pilgrimage to Canada, right, that the center actually was somewhere else. That wasn't the periphery, that was the center, right? And so sort of, I guess, trying to keep my eyes on the center of things, and mercy not as something that I exercise because I have power to forgive or to administer, right? But that I have an invitation to really enter into other people's lives to accompany them.
Thank you, each of you, and thank you to our audience for being here, and Professor Schmalz for having been here. So thanks, and what would you say? Buonasera. Have a good evening.